We're going to look at some more contract verbs. If you are in my church course, you will know that we've combined this session with a previous one on epsilon omega contract verbs. This time we want to include chapter 8, alpha omega verbs, and also add in a little bit Omicron Omega contract verbs. If you are in first semester at FC College, this video will be a separate video, and we will be considering chapter 8 separately. If you're in the church course, we are considering all contract verbs together. But right now, let's just concentrate on chapter 8, on what it says about, what our author says about alpha omega contract verbs. And I'll share my screen with you as usual. And we'll look at, my computer is a little bit slow today. We'll look at, again, contract verbs, but this time we'll look at let me skip down. I'm not starting in the place I wanted. We'll look at alpha omega contract verbs. So here we are. I think you can see my screen. And you'll notice again that when we say contract verbs alpha omega, we mean a verb that's the stem of the verb ends in a vowel, this time alpha, and we add, in this case, the present tense endings, which start with omega. O, es, e, omen, ete, usi. We've learned I, you, singular, he, she, it, we, you, they. 6 forms that express the different persons and numbers of verb forms. But with verbs that end, their stem ends in a vowel, there's a contraction that takes place. Page 79 and 80, if you are using the 5th edition of our textbook, and page 81 and 82, if you are using the 6th edition of our textbook. Chapter 8, alpha omega verbs. And you'll notice that right at the beginning of chapter 8 on page 81 that he lists for us these present tense endings and leaves them with the stem agapa. And our verb that we're looking at here in the textbook is agapao. If I stop sharing for just a moment and write this verb on the board here, of course, as you think about it, you recognize it immediately. Most people know the word agape, and this is simply the verb form, agapao, I am loving. The thing we need to remember is that contract verbs will appear this way with their contract vowel, this one, in the dictionary, but they will not appear this way in the New Testament. This way, in the dictionary, we know that we are dealing with a contract verb, so it's important that we have it there, but we will never see this form in the New Testament. Instead, we go back to our rules of contraction that he shows us on page 81. Alpha plus epsilon will become simply alpha. Alpha is a dominating partner and takes over. And therefore, the epsilon disappears. But notice in the third person singular, the iota still exists, but only as a subscript. What makes gives us a clue that we're dealing with a contract verb is the circumflex accent. We'll go over these in just a moment. I'm just wanting to show you what these rules look like. Alpha plus omicron will become omega. Here we have a true marriage of two vowels coming together to form a new one. If you use the biblical picture of marriage, this is a biblical marriage, although we're talking about grammar. So luomen becomes agapolmen. The omicron changes to omega, and the circumflex accent shows there's been a contraction. If you have upsilon, it disappears, as in usin, or third person singular, our ending becomes osin. Simply omega and upsilon is gone. And iota always becomes an iota subscript, as in you are loving, you singular are loving, lues, you are loosing, but you are loving, agapas. Notice the iota subscript in the contraction. So let's take a common alpha omega verb, but a different one, this time horao. This is the way you will see it in the dictionary, in the lexicon. I am seeing. Or it will say a gloss, to see, which is not quite correct because that's an infinitive form, but never mind. It's become common use to use the first person singular to show the meaning of the verb, of a verb. But it doesn't look that way. You never find horao actually in the New Testament. The contraction takes place. I see, or I am seeing, is horo. Notice the hard breathing, horo. I am seeing, or a simple present, I see. The contraction has taken place. Omega combines with alpha. Omega is the strongest of all the vowels, and all that's left of the contraction is the circumflex accent. Different with epsilon iota, as in oes, you are seeing, it becomes horas. And notice the iota goes under the alpha as a subscript. And again, we have a circumflex accent that shows we have had a contraction. If we put oas a, if we put the third person singular with hora, with this verb, it will become hora and will be pronounced hora, but there's an iota subscript and a circumflex accent. He, she, it is seeing, or he, she, it sees, simple present. Omen, by the rules of contraction, becomes omen with circumflex accent. Horomen, we see, or we are seeing. And the second person plural, you, plural, hora, ete, can't remain that way, but the alpha takes over. It's stronger than epsilon. And we have horate, circumflex accent. You, plural, are seeing, or you, plural, see. And then finally, our third person plural becomes osin, usin to osin. They are seeing, or they see. You should look at the vocabulary at the end of chapter 8. It's a short chapter. There's really not that much to learn in chapter 8. Once you learn the rules of contraction and how they look in the present tense. But we have some of the most common verbs in the New Testament, starting with agapao. And again, this is the way you will find it in a dictionary, but it's not the way you will find it in the New Testament because it will always contract with the ending. Another verb is genao. and it means I beget, I bear, I produce. Beget in the sense of having a child, but can also have a broader meaning of to bear or produce. But it is an alpha omega verb. Important to remember that it has two nous in the middle, because there's another verb, ginomai, that only has one nous, and students tend to confuse them, especially in other tenses. Ep eratao is an example of adding a preposition, epi, to, well, sorry, I don't have it, to simply erotao. You will find both verbs, and they are listed in the vocabulary. Erotao, I ask. Ep erotao, I ask, probably meant more I demand in the beginning, but as happens with languages, words tend to lose their distinction over time. There may be contexts where ep erotao would mean more I demand, but generally ep erotao and erotao simply mean I ask. But again, you will never find erotao, only in the dictionary in the New Testament, eroto. I am asking, or I ask. There's a contraction that takes place. Zao is one that you need to notice on the next page, 82. Note 4, he describes that this is not really an alpha omega verb, but it has a completely different way of a different paradigm. And it is a common verb in the New Testament, so you do need to learn the present tense paradigm. After this, it will become easy, but watch out that you don't write these forms wrong. Paul says, I live, zo, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And he uses this verb. So, these are the most common alpha omega verbs. Chapter 28, section 1, almost the last chapter in the book, introduces us to also what we call omicron omega verbs, where the ending of the stem is omicron. When you add the endings of the present tense, then you have a completely different set of endings. If you look in chapter 28, section 1, on page 266, if you're using the 6th edition, just in the table in the upper left column only, the present active. Most of you who are watching this will have only had up through chapter 8 in our textbook. So 28 is almost at the end of the book. And these other forms, the imperfect and so on, we haven't had yet. But we have had the endings of the present active. And you'll notice what happens when o, ace, a, omen, eta, usi are combined with omicron omega verbs. In this case, he uses pleroo, I fulfill, or I fill. And he gives you the endings, plero, pleois, pleroi, and so on for these verbs. In the vocabulary, I won't require you now to learn in Greek 1, but we have two more very important verbs in the New Testament that are omicron omega verbs. Stauro, I crucify, and dikaio, also an omicron omega verb. I justify, I make righteous, not in the sense of actually someone becoming good or holy, but being declared legally right. The process of, or the act of justification, to justify someone. To make holy, to sanctify, by the way, is a process, but to declare holy is something that God does as in an instant when we put our faith and trust in Christ. And it's important to distinguish between justification, I justify, dikaio, and sanctification, to make holy, which is another verb and for another time. Our Omicron Omega verbs are not so important right now. I will not ask you about them. We will not have sentences for the time being using them, but keep it in the back of your mind. We also have these kinds of contract verbs. Again, usually with a circumflex accent that shows there's been, in the case of the first person, for example, I am loving, agapo, circumflex accent shows that there's a contraction that has taken place.